All right, welcome to the John David Ebert School for the study of culture, cosmology, and the arts. We've already had our first course, Transformations of Consciousness Through Time, and this will be our second course, Understanding Mythology. So we're going to go through the primary theoreticians of myth, such as Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and William Irwin Thompson, and individuals like that. We'll go through them, but in this first class here, the introductory lecture, I want to go through and talk about what is a myth and how does it function, what does it do. So the very first thing I want to point out is that myth builds civilization. That's what it is. It's the DNA of a civilization. And here is the city-state of Ur, which dates out, it's one of the world's oldest and first cities, dates back to about 3500 BC. And you can see the central, this is the nucleus here, as though this were a giant living cell. The ziggurat here is the nucleus, because it is the center where all the rituals are enacted that animate the city. And a ritual is the performance of a myth. The myth is the DNA, let's say the genotype, whereas the ritual is the phenotype. And the myth that brought these city-states into being is the idea that the gods are up there. They are in the stars, such as Enki, Inanna, those gods can only be accessed by ascending the staircase at the top to commune with them. Then the god comes down to visit your ziggurat, as though it were, let's say, a hotel. And the place better be nice and spiffy and clean so that the gods will want to come down and visit the city. Because if it isn't, bad things will happen to the city. So people are called upon to do corvée labor, to work and till the fields for the gods, not for some abstract ideas. Religion, which is of course what the core of it is myth, whereas religion combines myth with practical applications like the liturgy, the rituals, all of those kinds of things. That's religion. But the myth is there first, and the myth comes from visionary minds, visionary imaginations, individuals who receive spiritual visions, not from their brains, but from spirit beings who live in higher worlds, other spiritual dimensions, who actually put these ideas into the minds of great visionaries and seers. The angel Gabriel comes down, as the Islamic myth says, and whispers into the ear of Muhammad the whole Quran, and that brings Islamic civilization into being. That annunciatory event. Religions usually, very often do have an annunciatory event. The crucifixion of Christ is the annunciatory event for bringing into being the civilization of Christianity. And so we're all in this together. That's the myth for the gods, to make the gods happy. Otherwise, terrible things will happen to our city. Another city will conquer us. If another city conquers us, that's because we didn't please Nanasin, who is the moon god of Ur, the primary god. Each city has at least one primary god. All right, but back before this, then, let's take a look at an earlier period. That was 3500 BC. This is how people were living in the Middle East in 6000 BC, roughly. This is the village of Çatalhöyük, a by now very famous image. And here we can see that what has happened when you look at the first city there with Ur is that agglomerations of villages like this have slowly glued together. You can see them here. This might be Çatalhöyük type style village over here, and they just slowly accreted over time to form the first city. So it's a process of accretion, but the glue that holds it together is, of course, myth and ritual. But here, they're not worshiping sky gods here. And note that the village does not have any streets. The street has not yet been invented. And the only way to enter the house is through the rooftop. All the houses are connected, which makes it very tough to destroy, because there's no surrounding wall to take away the city or destroy it. You'd have to tear the whole thing down, which is a very tough feat to perform. So it's defensive on the one hand. But then also the cults that they're worshiping here are the cult of the bull and the cult of the goddess. They're still worshiping goddesses, which has been going on since the Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic. And the bull, the goddess and the bull, which is the title of the archaeologist Ian Hodder, who is currently the archaeologist of Çatalhöyük. wrote a book called The Goddess and the Bull, which goes all the way back to one of the first villages, Muraibet, where they start pairing those two together and worshiping them together. Back even earlier than that, then, this is how humans lived, although this isn't a living settlement, this is a ritual settlement. 12,000 BC, 12,000 to 10,000, somewhere in there. It might be closer to 10,000, actually, but it is in the Mesolithic now, between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. The Paleolithic world is melting away, literally as the glaciers melt and submerge many of the caves. That world ended. And here we have large collective tasks that are undertaken by large groups of individuals who are very organized for performing the world's oldest megalithic site, where the myth here is very different. They're worshiping dead ancestors along with animal totems, and they have shamans as well. These T-shaped capitals, in many cases, are also ancestral figures. As you can see here on some of them, they have arms right here, and this one back here has arms on the sides. So these are the ancient elders, the ancestors, and some of these have animal totems all over them. This looks like a scorpion over here. And it is possible that it may be imagined that these pillars have thrust up from the underworld, that the earth has actually given rise to these dead ancestors. That is very possible. Here is a carving from Göbekli Tepe, and here you can see it's a more literalistic representation of either a shaman or a dead ancestor, and the arms are down on the sides here, just exactly as they are. If we take a glance back here, we can see them that they're in the same position. So different mythology is going on here. Let's take a look at some of the pillars on this site, where you can clearly see a bull that's charging, and what looks like maybe a fox and an ostrich. So these are totem animal beings. So there's a sort of way in which the let's see if there's any more. Okay, nothing else on this side. But almost as though the animals on the walls of the Paleolithic caves have now become portable. They've been stripped from the walls, and now they are on these T-shaped pillars that are coming up out of the earth, if that is indeed the case. Klaus Schmidt, the individual who originally dug these up, thought that there might be graves, that they might be grave markers down beneath them, but that's as far as he's excavated, so we're not sure. There are plans to rebuild this site as a simulacrum, a perfect simulacrum of it, so we can see it looking all bright, shining, and new as it was 12,000 BC or so. Okay, so back then before this, about 20 to 25,000 BC, this is how people were living. This is Dolní Věstonice, which is in the Czech Republic, and they were not only living in caves at this time, but also at this site in particular, which was a very large site. They're living in huts that are built out of mammoth bones. And so the cosmology here is that they are actually living on the inside of the cosmic mammoth. That's the cosmology. And here is a cross-section of some of the religion and mythological things that were going on. We have shamans, a lot of female shamans at this site with drums. And the shaman activates the drum to ascend the cosmic ladder, the cosmic axis that will take him up into the upper worlds, where he can visualize the animal totems, these sort of spiritual forms, the Platonic idea forms of the animals, and commune with them and get information from them, from the spirits, and then come back and communicate to the tribe, almost like mediums do to this day. Here's a goddess figurine and another interesting portrait study of what looks like a deformed individual, and very often shamans were deformed. You dig up their graves and you find that they had all kinds of debilities, and one of the oldest shamans in the world, whom Jean Al named Kreb, in her Clan of the Cave Bear book, had a withered arm when his grave was dug up. And this grave was very odd. 3 individuals sprinkled with red ochre. Now, red ochre is meant to resurrect the dead because it substitutes for the menstrual blood. The reason being for that is that it was anciently thought, all the way down to the time of Aristotle, in fact, that the reason the woman stops menstruating when she gets pregnant is that she's using that blood now to build the fetus. which is not 100% untrue, actually. So that's why they sprinkle red ochre to reanimate these bodies. But what's really weird about this is we have 3 burials, 1 woman and 2 men. This guy is turned on his belly, and I'm not sure whether this is the woman or the man, but his arms are in her lap, and possibly the red ochre is there to indicate menstrual blood more specifically. A strange burial, and no one has explained it. Very bizarre. But that's the mythology of the Paleolithic. It's animated by what Joseph Campbell called the animal powers. And the animal powers are pretty much the primary Platonic forms that animate and give life to the society. They are sacred beings. And the animal gives itself willingly in a willing sacrifice to human beings, who then return by propitiating it through the rites. And the rites magically restore and multiply by contact with the Platonic animal forms, multiplies the herds magically. That's why the rituals are so important, and why the animal in the myths agrees willingly to give itself as a sacrifice. So that's the way of the animal powers. Whereas with the Neolithic period, which brings in human sacrifice and the worship of the goddess, more specifically, the emphasis is more on the goddess than it was in the Paleolithic, although she was there. She is the mistress who gives birth to the herds, let's say, in a certain way. The Eskimo goddess Sedna, the mistress of the herds, is a kind of echo of her. And so, yes, and so the way of the seated earth, Campbell calls the second period, when the Neolithic comes in and people are living in villages that are rooted now to the earth. They're axially rooted, as was the case as we saw with Çatalhöyük back here. Let's see, Çatalhöyük. So that's the way of the seated earth. It's fundamentally agrarian. And so humans are sacrificed now, not animals, because humans are sacrificed in order to water the crops with blood, which is what the Aztecs and the Maya did. In that civilization, blood was the fuel, the oil, let's say, that ran that civilization. And so we have to give back to the primary god that sacrificed itself willingly, just like the animals were doing in the Paleolithic. In the second epoch, the humans are a primordial human sacrifices itself, allows itself to be killed, cut up, torn apart, like Osiris, let's say, and the pieces are scattered to the 4 winds, and where each one is buried by Isis in this case, the crops grow up. So the crop grows up from the sacrificed being. So that's the myth that informs human sacrifice and the blood that makes the crops grow. So that's there. And then with this civilization, with the first civilization, the Sumerian and the Egyptian, which represent the first generation of high civilization, human sacrifice is pretty much gone by this point. Sacrifices of goats, cows, and sheep are offered to the gods now. So it's back to the sacrificing of the animals. Humans not so often, although later on in Sumer they will be at the courts of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, which Sir Leonard Woolley dug up. And this is about 1,000 years later, about 2600 BC, when the king and the entire court is sacrificed and buried. But it isn't there, and that may have come in from the Egyptians, because the Egyptians originated the practice of ritual regicide starting in their very first dynasty, about 3000 BC. So the Egyptians had it first. And it seems as though civilization migrated from Mesopotamia to Egypt, but then the practice of mass human sacrifice then seems to have migrated back from Egypt to Sumer, because it doesn't appear there before 2600 BC. So interesting how civilizations trade semiotics. Okay, let's see where we were at. So now, let's go over Joseph Campbell's very succinct idea of mythology having 4 distinct functions. 2 of them metaphysical, the mystical and cosmological, and 2 of them physical. This is sociological and the pedagogical, or also psychological, you could call it. And so with the primary function of myth for Joseph Campbell was the metaphysical function. That the myth has to touch and awaken a sense of awe and wonder. It has to touch and activate the soul, and so the soul is lifted up out of its animal body and can perceive the world of spiritual powers. And that way, the physical world of space and time becomes like stained glass. It's transparent to the transcendent. That's the primary job of myth, according to Joseph Campbell. That's the most important of its functions, to awaken that sense of awe and wonder. We no longer have this except in some of our movies, maybe, like the original Star Wars films did that function, I think, very well, with the idea of the Force, a mystical power moving through all things. Then there is also a cosmological function, and we have looked at the cosmologies of these respective ways of the animal powers, the way of the seeded earth, and then with the rise of high civilization, the way of the celestial lights, because the gods become transformed into the planets. Nanasene is the moon god, Inanna is the planet Venus, and so on. So the gods are now in the planets. So the cosmological function, myth has to explain how the universe is, why it is, and what it is, and it has to give a specific image or picture, a structuring image that then becomes transparent to the transcendent. So those two are metaphysical, just like it's analogous to Francis Bacon's breakdown of Aristotle's four causes of the formal and final causes. Those are metaphysical, Bacon says, whereas the efficient and material causes are physical. So that on the physical plane, the other functions of myth are sociological. So the myth has to validate a certain social order, a certain way of being in the world, a certain ethos. And each civilization has a different ethos. Every single one of them does. India has the caste system as its form of social organization. No other society does. The medieval West had feudalism as its form of sociological organization. In India, you have dharma. That's the concept of duty. Each person in each caste has a duty that they have to carry out. China has a different idea. Each one of the civilizations have different ideas. Nietzsche talks about in Zarathustra, where he's discussing the master morality versus the slave morality. And he says that master morality was the morality of the Greeks, a morality that you have power. He is good who has power to repay an insult, and does indeed pay it back through war or conflict or the agon. He is bad who does not have any power. The slaves are bad. They're not evil. They're just bad. They're beneath contempt. So we have the ethical system there of good and bad. But with Christianity now, we get a different ethical system altogether, which is based on good and evil. He is good who is among us, who is one of us, who is part of our consensus and is on the same plane with us. He is evil who has the power to harm us. The Romans, let's say, harming the early Christian martyrs. So two totally different forms of ethics there that Nietzsche identified. So part of a mythology is to incorporate, it has an integrating social function. It pulls people together to form a community, to form a society, a nation, or a polis, or a Sumerian city-state. They're all held together by this sociological glue provided by the myth that integrates people so that they have the presence of what Bernard Stiegler calls a we feeling. Now, this we feeling is precisely what we don't have in American society, which is based on exactly the opposite. It's based on the ego myth of I feeling. Climbing up the skyscraper, and you get to the top of the skyscraper. The skyscraper grows if you feed it money. You feed money to it and it grows. And look at me, I'm above everyone else. I'm on top of the world. My ego has been magnified at the expense of everyone else. So there really is no we feeling, which is why the society generates spree killers who are suffering from a we feeling. They're outcasts, social isolates. They've been made fun of and bullied, many of them. Charles Whitman, the first of them in 1966, ascends a skyscraper, a miniature skyscraper, at the University of Texas in Austin, because he has failed at everything. He has failed as a Marine, he has failed at his marriage, and he has failed at his university education. So he's been totally excluded from any sense of we feeling. What Ibn Khaldun, in his history of civilizations, calls them, the Mukaddimah calls asabia, the we feeling that glues them together. And so Whitman then ascends to the top of this tower with a gun, and now his eye is the largest eye anywhere around, and he reduces everyone else on the ground to others below him whom he can just simply delete out of existence. Now he's the tallest one in the world. So note that. That's what we're suffering from, is a myth that integrates the society as a whole. We have pop culture myths, like Star Wars and the Marvel superhero movies, but they don't perform the same function. All they do is perform a temporary we feeling when you're in that auditorium watching those movies. Or when you're talking with friends about the movies that you like, you're all kind of temporarily glued together with a very temporary we feeling. There is no overarching mythology anymore, since our high religions have mostly broken down. They're mostly in desuetude. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, they're all crumbling. But especially in America, America is a shining exemplar of the lack of a we feeling that a mythology would provide, a single overarching mythology that every American agreed to. Just the way, say, Muhammad glued all the various Arabic tribes who up to that point were at war with each other, and each tribe had its own we feeling, but Muhammad glued them together by saying, here's the myth. He doesn't call it a myth, of course. He says, I have a message from the angel Gabriel, and this will unite us all. And it does. It creates a we feeling, and then you get the Rashidun Caliphate, the first 4 caliphs, and then they say, well, let's go make war on the infidel. So they project their aggression outwards toward other individuals, and that becomes part of their mythology, the mythology of jihad and so forth. So the sociological function is extraordinarily important, because when it isn't there, when the rites and rituals in a society break down and they're no longer practiced and they're just dismissed, the society goes to pieces. That's why rituals are so important, because they canalize psychological energy. And then the pedagogical function is actually, should be here, the psychological function. This is sort of the Jungian individuation process, let's say. The myths have to guide the individual through the various stages of life and the thresholds. There's Rudolf Steiner had this idea, for instance, that the human life cycle unfolds every 7 years, a different thing happens. The physical body is developing during the first 7 years, and at 7, the etheric body, which has been organizing it, is freed up and can be used now for the child to start doing some thinking. This coincides with the change of the teeth and so forth. And then at 14, the astral body, with all of its passions and desires, comes in with the sex drive and the change in the hormones and menstruation for girls and so forth. The whole body undergoes a transformation. Then at 21, the psyche attains a certain degree of maturity and an ability to think for oneself, and so on. So you have to move from childhood to adolescence to maturity to old age, and ultimately to death. And so one of the most important things for myth is to guide the individual through these stages, because the individual can get stuck. And if the individual does get stuck, then you've got a neurotic. So a neurotic has to go to see either Freud or Jung to get the neuroses fixed, so that he can move out of, an 18-year-old infant who's behaving like a child in relation to his mother, let's say. Or even worse, a 40-year-old. He thinks he's 20 and he's driving around in a sports car trying to impress women, and just looks completely ridiculous, because his mind is stuck in infancy. He never made it over the threshold, because here again, this is a concrete illustration of why our society has broken down, because the myths aren't working. They aren't working on a sociological level to glue people together, and they aren't working on a psychological level to get people across the thresholds of maturity and old age and death. There's just nothing there to guide the individual, so he or she is hapless, completely and totally hapless. And so now the other thing that myths do is that they are symbols of transformation. They catalyze and release transformations of energy, what Jung calls libido, in the psyche, which can get stuck and jammed. And your dreams will tell you this. An individual who's having nightmares means that there's the psychic energy within him needs transformation. And so very often Jung's idea is that very often what will happen is that the psyche needs to see the right image at the right time, and it can catalyze and transform the psyche. Life for Jung consists of transformations. That's what the individuation process is. How one becomes what one is something we find out as we go along through the course of life. But symbols let's say right brain symbols are absolutely necessary for this process. Now, there's a concrete illustration of how this might work with something that Russian biologists about half a century ago figured out, something called what they called innate releasing mechanisms that can be found and demonstrated in animals. And we call these instincts, but it's concrete. Here it says herringull chicks use a moving red spot on a bill as a sign stimulus to recognize their mother. So it's an innate mechanism that triggers in the mind of the chick that it knows that this is its mother. Down here, a yellow stick with red spots acts as what's called a supernormal sign stimulus. So here's the beak. Here's no spot, no movement, horizontal head, cock's head, black head, spot on a head. So here's the stick right here. So what you could do is make an artificial stick with a red spot on it, and the chick will react and think it's its mother. So there's other examples too, like when baby chicks hatch, let's say near the beach, they hatch and, or rather baby turtles hatch near the beach, and they know immediately to run for those waves to dodge the eagles that are up above them, that are waiting to grab them. They don't have to be instructed in that. They already know from seeing the eagle that it triggers in their nervous system movement, motion. It's time to go. It's time to get up and go. Also, there are experiments done on chicks, also with hawks, that have similar results. And here the supernormal sign stimulus is that you can make a fake hawk and draw it on a string, let's say, across a group of baby chicks, and they'll run. But if you take that same hawk and you draw it backwards, no response. So there's a click there in the nervous system of the chicks. And so Jung's idea and Campbell's idea is that myths work just like this. They catalyze and transform and release within us. The mind is not a blank slate. It is not born a blank slate. It is born with instincts and with archetypes that are in it. And archetypes, as we'll see when we get to the discussion of Jung, archetypes do the exact same thing. They act as these sort of supernormal sign stimuli that transform psychological problems within us, that transform the consciousness, that awaken new capacities and potentialities. When the individual sees the right image at the right time, then there's a complete transformation in one's life. And this is how both Jung and Campbell believed that myth works. So art, in a way, could be thought of as a supernormal sign stimulus that activates the human nervous system. Now, the difference with humans is that the nervous system is far more open to the imprints of experience, not the a priori innate releasing mechanisms, but the empirical or a posteriori aspect of it, being open to the imprints of experience. So what can happen there too is that the mind can have what's called a premature cognitive commitment. It can get stuck in a situation where it thinks early on that this is the way things always are. I think that there were experiments done with tying a baby elephant to a tree, and as it grows up and is tied to the tree again, let's say as an adult, it won't leave the tree because it's had a premature cognitive commitment that it can't move the tree, even though it's this giant behemoth that obviously can move the small tree. So that's the opposite aspect of this phenomenon, premature cognitive commitments. So the human nervous system is far more open to the imprints of experience, but there are definitely innate releasing mechanisms in the human nervous system as well that are activated, I believe, by art, ritual, symbol, and myth. That's why we have them. All right, so that's our discussion on our introductory discussion here in our course on understanding mythology. And that's what myths are and what they do and how they function. So next up, we'll look at Carl Jung and Freud and their conflict, and how Jung's whole theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious emerged out of their conflict.